The sun was setting over downtown as Robert finished his evening run. Sweat dripped down his face as he slowed to a walk, checking his fitness watch. 5 miles done. Not bad for a Tuesday night. At 34 years old, Robert kept himself in the same shape he was in during his military days. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall with broad shoulders, he still looked every bit the soldier he once was. Even in civilian clothes, there was something about the way he carried himself that screamed discipline and training. Robert pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. His sister had texted asking about dinner plans for the weekend. His mom wanted to know if he was eating enough vegetables. Normal family stuff that made him smile. After years of overseas deployments and dangerous missions, he loved these simple moments. The downtown area was busy tonight. People walked dogs, couples held hands on benches, and joggers like himself filled the sidewalks. Robert enjoyed living in this part of the city. It felt safe and normal, something he had earned after serving his country for 8 years. He worked now as a computer security expert for the government. Not the kind of job he could talk about at parties, but it paid well and used his military training in new ways. His clearance level was so high that most people at his own office didn't know exactly what he did all day. Tonight was no different. He had left work around 6, changed into his running gear and hit the pavement. Exercise helped him think clearly. It also helped him sleep better, something that had been a problem since coming back from his last deployment 3 years ago. As he walked toward his car, Robert noticed a police cruiser slowly driving down the street. Nothing unusual about that. This was a busy area, and cops patrolled here regularly. He gave a small nod to the officers inside as they passed. One of them stared at him a bit longer than normal, but Robert didn't think much of it. His phone buzzed with a work notification. Even though he was off duty, certain alerts always came through. Robert glanced at the screen. It was a routine check-in reminder for later tonight. He was monitoring something important, something that required him to log in every few hours to make sure everything was running smoothly. Robert reached his silver sedan and fumbled in his pocket for his keys. His workout gear didn't have many pockets, so he had to be careful not to drop his phone or wallet. As he found his keys, he heard a car door slam behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Robert turned around to see 2 police officers walking toward him. Both were white men, probably in their 30s. One was taller and thinner, the other shorter and stockier. They looked serious, but not necessarily angry. Robert assumed they wanted to ask him about something he might have seen during his run. "Evening, officers," Robert said, putting his keys back in his pocket. "How can I help you?" The taller officer looked him up and down carefully. "We need to ask you a few questions. There was an incident nearby, and you match a description we received." Robert felt his stomach tighten slightly. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. Being a tall, athletic black man sometimes meant getting stopped by police more often than he would like. Usually these interactions ended quickly, once officers realized he was former military and had a clean record. "Sure, no problem," Robert said, keeping his voice calm and friendly. "What kind of incident?" Meanwhile, about 3 miles away, the real criminal was counting stolen cash in an abandoned parking lot. 20 minutes earlier, he had robbed a convenience store at gunpoint, taking about $200 from the register. He was shorter than Robert by several inches and at least 40 pounds lighter. His face was thinner, and he had a small scar above his left eyebrow that Robert definitely didn't have. The store clerk had been terrified but managed to give police a description once the robber left. Unfortunately, in his panic, the clerk had gotten several details wrong. He told police the man was much taller than he actually was, and the clothing description was vague enough to match thousands of people in the city. The police radio had crackled with the description. "Suspect is a tall black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark athletic clothing. Consider armed and dangerous." The dispatch didn't include details about the suspect's build, facial features, or age. It was the kind of rushed description that happens when everyone is trying to respond quickly to a crime in progress. Back at Robert's car, the shorter officer was speaking into his radio while his partner kept talking to Robert. "The incident was a robbery about 20 minutes ago. the taller officer explained. The suspect was described as a tall black male in athletic wear. Robert looked down at his own clothes, dark running shorts, a gray t-shirt, and running shoes. Pretty standard workout gear that probably half the men in the city owned. I understand why you might want to talk to me, Robert said carefully. But I've been running for the past hour. I started from my apartment about 5 miles from here. I can show you my route on my fitness app if that helps. Robert reached slowly for his phone, making sure to move deliberately so the officers wouldn't be startled. He had learned from his military training and previous police encounters that sudden movements could escalate situations quickly. The taller officer held up a hand. "Keep your hands where we can see them for now, sir." Something in the officer's tone made Robert more alert. This was starting to feel less like a routine question session and more like he was being treated as a suspect. "Officers, I think there might be some confusion here," Robert said, keeping his hands visible. "I'm a veteran, and I work for the government. I have ID that can verify who I am." The shorter officer finished his radio conversation and rejoined his partner. Robert couldn't hear what was said, but both officers seemed more tense now. "Sir, we need you to put your hands behind your back," the shorter officer said, pulling out handcuffs. Robert felt his heart rate spike. This was going from bad to worse very quickly. "Wait, hold on," Robert said, his voice still controlled but with an edge of concern. "I haven't done anything wrong. You can verify my identity right now. I have my military ID, my government badge, everything you need." But the officers weren't listening anymore. They had received confirmation from dispatch that they should detain anyone matching the suspect description until they could sort things out properly. What nobody knew yet was that Robert's evening jog had just become the beginning of a chain of events that would bring the FBI to their small police station in less than an hour. As Robert stood there trying to explain who he was, the real robber was already planning his next target. And back at Robert's office, a computer system was quietly tracking his location, waiting for him to check in as scheduled. The pieces were all in motion, but nobody could see the bigger picture yet. Within minutes, a simple case of mistaken identity would become something much larger than anyone could have imagined. Robert could feel the situation spinning out of control. The two officers moved closer, and he noticed that the taller one had his hand resting on his weapon. Not drawn, but ready. This wasn't just a simple questioning anymore. "Officers, please," Robert said, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Just let me show you my ID. This is clearly a misunderstanding." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," the shorter officer repeated more firmly this time. "We can sort this out at the station." Around them, people on the sidewalk began to notice what was happening. A few stopped walking and pulled out their phones. Robert could see at least 3 people starting to record. In today's world, police interactions like this rarely went unnoticed. Robert knew he had a choice to make. He could resist and try to explain, which might make things worse, or he could comply and hope that common sense would win out once they checked his background. His military training kicked in. Sometimes the best strategy was to follow orders first and fight the battle later. "Okay," Robert said, slowly turning around. "I'm cooperating, but this is a mistake. My name is Robert Johnson. I'm a veteran and a government employee. You can verify this in about 30 seconds if you just check my ID." The shorter officer approached with handcuffs while his partner kept watch. Robert felt the cold metal click around his wrists. He had never been handcuffed before, not even during his wildest college days. The feeling was humiliating and scary at the same time. "Robert Johnson, you're being detained in connection with an armed robbery that occurred approximately 30 minutes ago," the taller officer said. "You have the right to remain silent." As the officer continued reading him his rights, Robert's mind raced. Armed robbery? This was much more serious than he had thought. No wonder the officers seemed so tense. "There's been a serious mistake," Robert said as soon as the officer finished. "I work in cybersecurity for a federal agency. I have a top-secret clearance. You can call my supervisor right now and verify this." But the officers weren't interested in phone calls. They had a suspect who matched their description, and their training told them to secure the scene first and ask questions later. The taller officer guided Robert toward their patrol car while his partner cleared a path through the growing crowd of onlookers. Robert could hear people murmuring and phones clicking as they took photos and videos. "This is crazy," a woman's voice said from the crowd. "That man was just jogging. I saw him running past my store earlier. Someone should call the news," another voice added. Robert felt a mix of embarrassment and fear. His face was now going to be all over social media as the suspected armed robber who got arrested downtown. Even if this got cleared up quickly, the damage to his reputation might take months to fix. The shorter officer opened the back door of the patrol car. "Watch your head," he said, not unkindly, as he helped Robert into the back seat. The inside of the police car smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. Robert sat awkwardly with his hands cuffed behind him, trying to process what was happening. Through the window he could see more people gathering. Some were still recording with their phones. The officers got into the front seats and started filling out paperwork. Robert could hear them talking quietly but couldn't make out the words. He noticed one of them typing on a laptop, probably running his information through their system. "Officers," Robert said through the mesh barrier between the front and back seats. "When you run my name, you're going to see that I have no criminal record. I've never even had a speeding ticket. I'm telling you, this is the wrong guy." The taller officer looked back at him. "Sir, please remain quiet while we process this information." Robert sat back and tried to stay calm. His military training had taught him how to handle stress, but this was different. In the military, even in dangerous situations, he knew what was expected of him. Here he felt completely helpless. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Robert watched his own car getting smaller in the distance. His keys were still in his pocket, along with his wallet and phone. At least they hadn't taken those yet. The ride to the police station took about 10 minutes. Robert spent the time thinking about who he could call when they let him make a phone call. His sister was a lawyer, but she handled divorce cases, not criminal defense. His supervisor at work would be able to clear this up quickly, but Robert wasn't sure if he was allowed to mention his job or if that would create other problems. The police station was a newer building made of red brick and glass. Robert had driven past it hundreds of times but never imagined he would be seeing it from the inside. The officers parked in a secure area behind the building and led Robert through a back entrance. The hallways were painted an institutional green color and smelled like floor cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making everything look slightly sickly. They stopped at a desk where a sergeant was filling out paperwork. He looked up as they approached. "What do we have?" the sergeant asked. "Possible suspect in the convenience store robbery," the taller officer replied. "Matches the description, found him a few blocks from the scene." The sergeant looked at Robert with tired eyes. He was probably in his 50s with gray hair and the look of someone who had seen everything at least twice. "Name?" the sergeant asked. "Robert Johnson," Robert replied quickly. "And I need to tell you something important. I work for the federal government in a sensitive position. There are people who will be looking for me if I don't check in tonight." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Federal government?" "Cybersecurity," Robert said. "I can't give you details about what I do, but my supervisor needs to know where I am. This is a case of mistaken identity, and it could cause problems beyond just my personal situation." The sergeant made a note on his paperwork. "We'll get to that. First, we need to process you and get you into holding while we sort this out." "How long will that take?" Robert asked. "Depends on a lot of factors," the sergeant replied. "Could be a couple hours, could be longer." Robert felt his stomach drop. A couple of hours meant he would miss his scheduled check-in at work. Missing a check-in triggered automatic security protocols that he really didn't want to think about. "Please," Robert said. "I just need to make one phone call. My supervisor can clear this up in 5 minutes." But the processing had already begun. The officers led Robert down another hallway toward the holding cells. With each step, he felt like he was getting further away from a quick resolution. What Robert didn't know was that 3 miles away, the real robber was studying a map on his phone, looking for his next target. The man was desperate for money and had already decided that one robbery wasn't enough for the night. And back at Robert's office building, a computer server was quietly counting down the minutes until his next required check-in. The holding cell was exactly what Robert had expected and nothing like what he had hoped. Gray concrete walls, a metal bench that was somehow both too hard and too narrow, and a smell that suggested many people had been very unhappy in this space. Robert sat on the edge of the bench, his hands finally free after they had removed the handcuffs. His wrists were red and sore where the metal had pressed against his skin. He rubbed them slowly, trying to restore circulation while his mind raced through his options. The processing had taken longer than he expected. They had taken his fingerprints, photographed him from multiple angles, and asked him the same basic questions 3 different times. Each time, Robert had patiently explained who he was and what he did for work. Each time, the officers had nodded politely and continued with their procedures. "This is protocol," the desk sergeant had explained. "We have to follow certain steps regardless of what anyone claims. Once we verify your information, if you're not our guy, you'll be released." But Robert knew that verification wasn't going to be simple. His job wasn't the kind where someone could just call a main number and ask about employees. His supervisor worked in a classified section of a federal building that most people didn't even know existed. Through the small window in his cell door, Robert could see officers moving back and forth in the hallway. Some looked busy and focused. Others seemed to be having casual conversations. None of them looked particularly concerned about the possibility that they might have arrested the wrong person. Robert checked his watch. It was 8:30 in the evening. His required check-in was scheduled for 9 o'clock. If he missed it, several things would happen automatically. First, his supervisor would be notified immediately. Then, if Robert didn't respond to contact attempts within 30 minutes, a security team would be dispatched to his last known location. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same security protocols that were designed to protect him and his work were about to create a much bigger situation than anyone expected. Robert stood up and walked to the cell door. He could see an officer sitting at a desk about 20 feet away typing on a computer. "Excuse me," Robert called out. "Officer?" The man looked up from his computer. He was young, probably mid-20s, with short brown hair and a friendly face. "What can I do for you?" the officer asked, walking over to the cell. "I need to make a phone call," Robert said. "I know I have the right to make a call, and this is important. I work for the government, and if I don't check in tonight, it's going to cause problems." The officer looked sympathetic, but also a little skeptical. "What kind of government work?" Robert hesitated. He wasn't supposed to discuss his job with unauthorized people, but this situation was rapidly becoming an emergency. "Computer security," Robert said carefully. "I work on systems that require regular monitoring. If I don't log in tonight, my supervisors will assume something bad has happened to me." "Like what?" the officer asked. "Like I've been kidnapped or killed," Robert said bluntly. "The kind of work I do makes me a potential target for foreign agents or terrorist groups. My office takes security very seriously." The officer's expression changed slightly. He was starting to understand that this might not be a routine arrest. "I'll talk to the sergeant," the officer said. "See what we can do about that phone call." As the officer walked away, Robert sat back down on the bench. He tried to think through what would happen when he missed his check-in. His supervisor, a woman named Director Chen, was not the type of person who ignored security protocols. She would follow procedure exactly, which meant Robert's location would be tracked through his government-issued phone and ID card. Both of those items were currently sitting in a plastic bag at the front desk of the police station. Robert had worked for Director Chen for 2 years, and he had never seen her deviate from proper procedure even once. She ran their department like a military unit, which made sense since she was also a veteran. If one of her people missed a check-in, she would assume the worst and respond accordingly. The work Robert did was sensitive enough that most of his family didn't know exactly what his job involved. He had told them he worked in computer security for the government, which was true but incomplete. In reality, he was part of a small team that monitored cyber threats against critical infrastructure targets. Tonight, he was supposed to check on a system that tracked suspicious online activity around power plants and water treatment facilities. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important. The kind of important that meant someone was always watching, always ready to respond if something went wrong. Robert heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up to see the young officer returning with the desk sergeant. "Johnson," the sergeant said, unlocking the cell door. "Come with me. You can make your phone call." Robert followed them down the hallway to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. An old-fashioned phone sat on the table, the kind with a curly cord that reminded Robert of his childhood. "You get 5 minutes, the sergeant said, "and we'll be monitoring the call, so don't say anything you wouldn't want us to hear." Robert nodded and picked up the phone. He dialed Director Chen's direct number, hoping she was still in the office. She often worked late, especially when operations were active. The phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Chen," Director, it's Robert, he said quickly. I have a situation. There was a brief pause. Are you secure? She asked. Robert glanced at the sergeant, who was clearly listening to every word. No, Robert replied. I'm at the downtown police station. I was arrested by mistake. They think I'm connected to an armed robbery. Another pause, longer this time. Are you injured? No, I'm fine. But I'm going to miss tonight's check-in. I wanted to call before the automatic systems kicked in. Understood, Director Chen said, her voice becoming more businesslike. What's your status? Are you being charged? They're still investigating. It's a case of mistaken identity. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I matched some general description of the real suspect. Robert could hear typing in the background. Director Chen was probably already pulling up his file and location data. I'm showing your last location as the police station, she said. Your device has been stationary there for 47 minutes. That's correct. They have my phone and ID in evidence processing. I understand. Do not discuss your work or clearance level with anyone there. I'm going to make some calls and see what we can do to expedite this. Robert felt a wave of relief. Director Chen would know how to handle this situation properly. Thank you, Director. I just want to get this cleared up and get back to normal. Stand by for further instructions, she said. And the line went dead. Robert hung up the phone and looked at the sergeant, who had been listening intently to the conversation. Your supervisor? The sergeant asked. Yes. She's going to make some calls and try to help sort this out. The sergeant nodded but didn't look entirely convinced. We'll see what happens. Back to the cell for now. As they walked back down the hallway, Robert felt a little better about his situation. Director Chen was competent and well-connected. If anyone could cut through red tape and get him released quickly, it would be her. What Robert didn't know was that Director Chen had immediately classified his detention as a potential security breach. Within minutes of their phone call, she would be briefing her supervisor, who would brief his supervisor, and so on up the chain of command. In the federal government, when someone with Robert's clearance level went missing or was detained, it became a matter of national security very quickly. While Robert sat in his holding cell trying to figure out how his evening jog had turned into a nightmare, the real criminal was 3 miles away, studying his next target through the dirty windshield of a stolen car. His name was Danny Rodriguez, and he was nothing like the man currently sitting in police custody. At 5 feet 8 inches and weighing about 150 pounds, Danny was significantly smaller than Robert. His face was thin and angular, with a small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. If the two men had been standing side by side, no one could have confused them. But Danny wasn't standing next to anyone right now. He was alone, desperate, and running out of options. The convenience store robbery had netted him exactly $214. Not nearly enough to solve his problems. Danny owed money to people who didn't accept late payments or payment plans, the kind of people who expressed their displeasure with baseball bats and crowbars. He had until midnight to come up with $800, or things were going to get very unpleasant for him. 200 wasn't going to cut it. Danny pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and studied the addresses he had written down earlier. Gas stations, convenience stores, and small restaurants that stayed open late. Places that might have cash on hand and wouldn't have too much security. His hands shook slightly as he folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. Danny had never thought of himself as a violent criminal. 6 months ago, he had been working at a warehouse, living in a small apartment and trying to stay clean from the drugs that had messed up his early 20s. But then the warehouse had closed down, moving operations overseas to save money. Danny had lost his job along with 200 other workers. His unemployment benefits barely covered rent, and he had started borrowing money just to buy food. One borrowed $20 became $50, then $100, then more. Before he knew it, Danny owed money to Tony Marcelli, a local loan shark who charged interest rates that would make credit card companies blush. Tonight was supposed to have been simple. One quick robbery, grab enough cash to pay Tony back, and then figure out a long-term solution to his problems. But $200 wasn't going to satisfy Tony, especially since Danny was already 2 weeks late on his payment. Danny started the stolen car and pulled out of the parking lot. He had taken the vehicle from a shopping center earlier in the day, choosing an older model that would be less likely to have GPS tracking or fancy security systems. His next target was a gas station about 2 miles north of where Robert had been arrested. Danny had watched the place for a week, noting that it only had one employee working the night shift and no security guard. The cameras looked old and probably didn't record very clearly. As he drove through the city streets, Danny tried not to think about what he was about to do. Robbing the convenience store had been terrifying enough. The clerk, a kid who couldn't have been older than 20, had looked absolutely terrified when Danny had pulled out the gun. The gun itself was another problem. Danny had bought it from a guy in a bar 3 days ago, paying $50 he couldn't afford for a rusty revolver that might not even work properly. He wasn't even sure if it was loaded, and he definitely didn't want to find out. But the gun had done its job at the convenience store. The young clerk had immediately opened the register and handed over all the cash without argument. Danny had grabbed the money and run, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. Now he was about to do it again. Danny pulled into the gas station parking lot and sat in his car for a few minutes watching the building. Through the large windows he could see one employee behind the counter, reading a magazine. There were no other customers and no other cars in the parking lot except for what was probably the employee's vehicle. Perfect conditions for robbery number 2. Danny checked his watch. 9:15. He had less than 3 hours to get the rest of the money he needed. If this gas station had as much cash as the convenience store, he would need to hit at least 2 more places tonight. He took a deep breath and got out of the car, pulling his hood up to partially hide his face from the security cameras. The gun was tucked into his waistband, hidden under his jacket but easily accessible. The gas station was brightly lit and smelled like coffee and cleaning supplies. Country music played softly from speakers mounted in the ceiling. Behind the counter, a man in his 30s looked up from his magazine and nodded politely. "Evening," the employee said. "What can I get you?" Danny walked slowly toward the counter, trying to look casual while his heart rate accelerated. "Just some cigarettes," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "What brand?" Danny named the first brand he could think of, not really caring since he didn't actually smoke. As the employee turned to get the cigarettes from the rack behind him, Danny pulled out the gun. "Don't turn around," Danny said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is a robbery. Just stay calm and nobody gets hurt." The employee froze with his hand reaching toward the cigarette rack. "Oh man," he said quietly. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious." "Turn around slowly and open the register. Give me all the cash." The employee turned around, his face pale but surprisingly calm. He was older than the convenience store clerk and had probably dealt with difficult situations before. "Okay," the employee said. "No problem. Just stay cool, all right?" He moved to the register and punched in a code. The drawer opened with the electronic beep, revealing several stacks of bills and a coin tray. "How much is in there?" Danny asked. "Maybe 300, the employee replied. "It's been a slow night." 300 would bring Danny's total to just over $500. Still not enough, but getting closer. "All of it," Danny said. "Put it in a bag." The employee grabbed a plastic shopping bag from under the counter and started loading the money into it. His hands were steady and he didn't seem panicked. "You know they're going to catch you, right?" the employee said conversationally as he worked. "These cameras record everything in high definition. Plus, I got a good look at your face." Danny felt a stab of fear but tried not to show it. "Just finish up and keep quiet." "I'm just saying," the employee continued. "Robbing places in the same city on the same night? That's not real smart. Cops are going to be looking for you now." The employee was right and Danny knew it. But he didn't have any choice. He needed the money tonight, not next week or next month. "Bag's ready," the employee said, holding it out. Danny grabbed the bag and backed toward the door. "Stay behind the counter for 5 minutes, he said. "Don't call the cops until I'm gone." "Sure thing," the employee replied. "But they're probably going to figure out it was the same guy pretty quick." Danny pushed through the door and ran to his car. As he drove away, he could see the employee in his rearview mirror, already reaching for what was probably a phone to call 911. 2 robberies down, and Danny still needed at least $300 more. The night was far from over, and with each crime, the chances of getting caught were getting higher. What Danny didn't know was that across town, the police were still convinced they had their robber safely locked up in a holding cell. At exactly 9 o'clock, a computer server in a secure federal building began running its automated check-in protocol. The system was designed to verify that all personnel assigned to critical monitoring duties were at their stations and actively engaged with their work. For Robert, this meant logging into a secure portal every 3 hours and confirming that all systems under his watch were functioning normally. It was a simple process that usually took less than 5 minutes, but missing it triggered a cascade of security responses that had been carefully designed to protect both personnel and sensitive operations. Director Lisa Chen sat in her office on the 15th floor of the federal building, staring at her computer screen as the automated alert popped up. Personnel check-in failure, Robert Johnson, 21 hours. The red text blinked urgently, demanding immediate attention. She had been expecting this alert ever since Robert's phone call 30 minutes ago. Even though she knew he was safe in police custody, the automated systems didn't care about explanations or special circumstances. They only knew that a person with top-secret clearance had failed to check in as required. Director Chen picked up her secure phone and dialed the number for the Emergency Response Center. The call was answered on the first ring. Emergency response, this is Agent Williams. This is Director Chen, Cybersecurity Division. I need to report a missed check-in for one of my analysts, but I have additional information about the circumstances. Go ahead. Director, Robert Johnson, ID number 7749 Alpha, missed his 2100 check-in. He is currently in police custody at the downtown station due to a case of mistaken identity. I spoke with him directly about 40 minutes ago. There was a pause as Agent Williams pulled up Robert's file on his computer. I see his security level here, Agent Williams said. This triggers a level 2 response regardless of the circumstances. Do you have confirmation that he is unharmed and not under duress? Affirmative. He called me from the police station. The detention appears to be legitimate, but it's based on misidentification. He was mistaken for an armed robbery suspect. Understood. I'm initiating the Level 2 protocol now. A response team will be dispatched to verify his location and status. ETA approximately 20 minutes. Director Chen felt her stomach tighten. She had hoped to resolve this quietly with a few phone calls, but the system was designed to err on the side of caution. A Level 2 response meant that federal agents would be showing up at the police station whether she wanted them to or not. Agent Williams, is there any way to handle this more discreetly? The local police don't know about Robert's clearance level or the nature of his work. Negative, Director. Once the protocol is initiated, it has to run its course. The response team will identify themselves appropriately and work with local law enforcement to resolve the situation. Director Chen hung up the phone and rubbed her temples. This situation was about to get much more complicated. In the secure basement of the federal building, 3 agents received their emergency assignment and began preparing for immediate deployment. Agent Sarah Mitchell, the team leader, reviewed Robert's file while her partners gathered their equipment. What do we know about this guy? Asked Agent Tom Bradley, checking his sidearm. Clean record, 8 years military service, been with our department for 2 years, Agent Mitchell replied. Works on infrastructure protection. High-value target if someone wanted to compromise our systems. You think this is a real kidnapping? Asked the third agent, Janet Torres. Could be. Or it could be exactly what his supervisor thinks it is. Wrong place, wrong time. Either way, we treat it as a potential security breach until we know for sure. The agents finished their preparations and headed for the parking garage. Their vehicle was a black SUV with government plates and enough communication equipment to coordinate with multiple agencies. They also carried federal credentials that would override local police authority if necessary. As they drove through the city toward the police station, Agent Mitchell was on the radio with the FBI field office, coordinating their response. This is Mobile Unit 7, she reported. En route to verify the status of a detained federal employee. May need assistance with local law enforcement cooperation. Copy, Mobile 7. FBI is standing by if needed. What's the nature of the security concern? Employee with TS clearance missed a required check-in. Currently detained by local police in connection with an armed robbery investigation. Understood. We'll have a team ready to assist if this escalates. Back at the police station, Robert was trying to stay patient in his holding cell. He had been there for over an hour now, and despite his phone call to Director Chen, nothing seemed to be happening. No one had come to verify his story or check his credentials more thoroughly. The young officer who had helped him make his phone call walked past his cell again, and Robert called out to him. Officer, any word on my situation? My supervisor was going to make some calls. The officer stopped and looked sympathetic. Sorry, man. The detective assigned to your case won't be in until tomorrow morning. They're treating this as a routine arrest until then. Tomorrow morning? Robert felt a wave of panic. I can't stay here overnight. This is a serious misunderstanding. I know it's frustrating, the officer said, but the system is what it is. Unless something changes dramatically, you're probably here until at least 6 a.m. Robert sat back down on the bench, his mind racing. If he was stuck here overnight, missing his check-in would be the least of his problems. His work involved monitoring systems that operated around the clock. Other team members could cover for him in an emergency, but his prolonged absence would trigger even more serious security protocols. He also thought about the personal consequences. By tomorrow morning, his arrest would probably be in the local news. His photo taken during booking might end up on social media. Even if he was cleared of all charges, the damage to his reputation could be significant. Robert checked his watch again. 9:20. His supervisor had probably received the automated alert about his missed check-in by now. He hoped she would be able to work some magic and get him out of this mess quickly. What Robert didn't know was that Director Chen's magic came in the form of federal agents with broad EO authority and very little patience for local bureaucracy. At that same moment, Agent Mitchell's team was pulling into the police station parking lot. Through the windows of their SUV, they could see the normal activity of a busy urban police station. Officers coming and going, patrol cars in the parking lot, nothing that looks suspicious or out of the ordinary. Looks quiet, Agent Torres observed. That's good, Agent Mitchell replied. Hopefully this is just a simple mix-up that we can resolve quickly. But as they walked toward the front entrance of the police station, Agent Mitchell's radio crackled with an update from their command center. Mobile 7, be advised. We're receiving reports of a second armed robbery in your area. Same suspect description as the first incident. Local police may have the wrong person in custody. Agent Mitchell stopped walking and keyed her radio. Copy that. Same suspect description as our detainee? Affirmative. Stand by for more information. The three agents looked at each other. If there had been a second robbery while Robert was in custody, it would prove his innocence and validate Director Chen's assessment of the situation. It would also mean that the local police had not only arrested the wrong person, but had stopped looking for the real criminal while he continued to commit crimes. Agent Mitchell keyed her radio again. Command, how recent was this second robbery? Approximately 15 minutes ago. Local units are responding now. Agent Mitchell made a decision. This was no longer just a welfare check on a detained federal employee. This was now a situation where local law enforcement had potentially compromised an ongoing investigation by arresting an innocent person. Torres, call for FBI backup, she ordered. Bradley, get our legal liaison on the phone. This just became a much bigger problem. As the three agents approached the front door of the police station, they had no idea that the real criminal was already planning his third robbery of the night. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when Officer Mike Stevens, working the front desk, noticed 3 black SUVs pulling into the parking lot in perfect formation. In his 12 years on the force, he had seen federal agents before, but never this many arriving at once. Agent Mitchell walked through the front door first, followed by her 2 partners. All 3 wore dark suits and carried themselves with the kind of confidence that came from having federal authority behind them. Agent Mitchell approached the front desk and pulled out her credentials. I'm Agent Mitchell, Department of Homeland Security, she said, showing her badge to Officer Stevens. I need to speak with whoever is in charge immediately. We have a situation involving one of your detainees. Officer Stevens looked at the badge carefully, then at the other 2 agents who had positioned themselves strategically near the entrance. What kind of situation? We have a federal employee in your custody who missed a required security check-in. I need to verify his status and well-being immediately. Before Officer Stevens could respond, his radio crackled with an urgent message from dispatch. All units. Second armed robbery reported at Murphy's gas station on 5th Street. Suspect description matches previous incident. Suspect is described as a Hispanic male, 5'8", approximately 150 pounds, wearing dark clothing. Agent Mitchell and Officer Stevens looked at each other. The description was significantly different from Robert, who was 6'2" and black. Who do you have in custody for the first robbery? Agent Mitchell asked. Officer Stevens checked his computer. Robert Johnson, picked up about 2 hours ago near the scene of the first incident. I need to see him now, Agent Mitchell said firmly. And I need to speak with your watch commander. Sergeant David Park, the watch commander, emerged from his office having overheard the conversation. He was a 20-year veteran who had dealt with federal agents before and knew that they didn't show up unless something was seriously wrong. "I'm Sergeant Park. What can I do for you folks?" Agent Mitchell showed her credentials again. "Sergeant, we believe you may have the wrong person in custody. The man you're holding for armed robbery is a federal employee with top-secret clearance. He missed a required security check-in, which triggered our response. And now there's been a second robbery," Agent Torres added, having listened to the radio traffic, "with a suspect description that doesn't match your detainee at all." Sergeant Park felt his stomach drop. Arresting the wrong person was bad enough, but arresting a federal employee with security clearance could become a career-ending mistake. "Let me get the arresting officers down here," he said, reaching for his radio. "No time for that," Agent Mitchell said. "I need to see Robert Johnson right now. This is a matter of national security." At that moment, the front door opened again and 3 more federal agents walked in. These wore FBI windbreakers and looked even more serious than the first group. Agent Jennifer Walsh, the FBI team leader, approached the group at the front desk. "Agent Mitchell? We're here to assist with the detainee situation." "Appreciate the backup," Agent Mitchell replied. "Sergeant Park here is about to take us to see our guy." Sergeant Park looked around at the 6 federal agents now crowding his lobby and made a quick decision. Whatever was going on here was way above his pay grade. "Follow me," he said, leading the group toward the holding cells. In his cell, Robert heard the sound of multiple footsteps coming down the hallway, more footsteps than usual and moving with purpose. He stood up and moved to the small window in his cell door. Through the window, he could see Sergeant Park approaching with a group of people in suits. Robert's heart started beating faster. Either this was very good news or very bad news, and he wasn't sure which. "Johnson," Sergeant Park called out as they reached his cell. "You have some visitors." Agent Mitchell stepped forward and showed her credentials through the window. "Robert Johnson? I'm Agent Mitchell, Homeland Security. Your supervisor sent us to check on your welfare." Robert felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. "Thank God. Agent Mitchell, this is all a huge misunderstanding. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "We know," Agent Mitchell said as Sergeant Park unlocked the cell door. "There's been a second robbery with a completely different suspect description. You're being released immediately." Robert stepped out of the cell and shook hands with Agent Mitchell. "I can't tell you how good it is to see you folks." Agent Walsh stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Agent Walsh with the FBI. We need to debrief you about this incident, but first we need to get you processed out and make sure you're medically cleared." "I'm fine," Robert said. "They treated me professionally. This was just a case of bad timing and worse luck." Sergeant Park was already on his radio, calling for the desk sergeant to begin release paperwork. The last thing he wanted was for this situation to escalate any further. As they walked back toward the front of the station, Agent Mitchell briefed Robert on what had happened after his phone call to Director Chen. "Your missed check-in triggered automatic protocols," she explained. "Your supervisor tried to handle it quietly, but the system doesn't allow for exceptions. Once you miss a check-in, we have to assume the worst until proven otherwise." "I understand," Robert said. "I just never imagined something like this could happen. Unfortunately, cases of mistaken identity happen more often than people think," Agent Walsh added. "The important thing is that you're safe and we can get this resolved." At the front desk, Officer Stevens was already pulling Robert's personal effects from the evidence locker. His phone, wallet, keys, and government ID were returned to him in a plastic bag. Robert checked his phone and saw 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. News of his arrest had apparently spread quickly among his family and friends. "You're going to have some explaining to do," Agent Torres observed. "That's an understatement," Robert replied, scrolling through the messages. Sergeant Park handed Robert a receipt for his personal property and a form acknowledging his release. "Mr. Johnson, I want to apologize for this situation. We were following proper procedure based on the information we had, but clearly there was a breakdown in communication." "I appreciate that, Sergeant," Robert said. "I don't blame the officers who arrested me. They were doing their job based on what they knew at the time." Agent Mitchell's radio crackled with an update from their command center. "Mobile 7, be advised. Local units have visual contact with the actual robbery suspect. Pursuit is in progress." "Copy that," Agent Mitchell replied. "We're completing processing of the federal detainee now." Agent Walsh stepped aside and made a quick phone call to her supervisor, briefing him on the situation and the successful recovery of the federal employee. "Sir, we have custody of the subject. He appears unharmed and reports professional treatment by local law enforcement. The mistaken identity has been confirmed by a second robbery with a different suspect description." As Robert signed the final paperwork for his release, he could hear police sirens in the distance. Somewhere out in the city, officers were chasing the real criminal while he stood in the lobby of the police station, finally free after 2 hours that had felt like 2 days. "What happens now?" Robert asked Agent Mitchell. "Now we take you back to your office so you can complete your check-in and debrief with your supervisor," she replied. "After that, there will probably be some paperwork about this incident, but nothing that should affect your clearance or your job." Robert nodded and took a deep breath. It was finally over, or at least this part of it was over. He still had to deal with the media attention, the social media posts, and the explaining he would have to do to everyone who had seen his arrest. But for now, he was free, and the real criminal was hopefully about to be caught. As Robert walked out of the police station flanked by federal agents, the radio chatter in the background told the story of a chase that was finally coming to an end 6 blocks away. "Suspect vehicle has crashed at the intersection of Maple and 3rd, came the crackling voice over the police radio. "Suspect is on foot, heading south through the residential area." Officer Jennifer Martinez was the first to spot Danny Rodriguez as he tried to climb a chain-link fence behind a row of houses. After crashing the stolen car while fleeing his 3rd robbery attempt of the night, Danny had managed to run only 2 blocks before exhaustion and poor physical condition caught up with him. "There," Officer Martinez shouted to her partner as they rounded the corner. "White male, dark clothing matches the description." Danny heard the shouts and looked back to see 2 officers running toward him. His legs felt like rubber and his lungs burned from the sprint. The fence was higher than he had thought, and his hands were shaking too badly to get a good grip on the chain links. "Stop right there," Officer Martinez called out. "Police, put your hands up." Danny raised his hands and turned around slowly. Up close, the difference between him and Robert was unmistakable. Danny was at least 6 inches shorter and 40 pounds lighter than the man who had spent the last 2 hours in a holding cell. His face was thin and angular, with nervous eyes that darted back and forth looking for an escape route that didn't exist. "I didn't do anything," Danny said automatically, even though the gun from his latest robbery attempt was still tucked in his waistband. Officer Martinez approached carefully while her partner called for backup. "Turn around and put your hands on the fence," she ordered. As Danny complied, Officer Martinez found the gun and a bag containing cash from 3 different robberies. The evidence was overwhelming, and Danny's description matched the reports from all 3 crime scenes perfectly. "Danny Rodriguez," she read from his driver's license after finding his wallet. "You're under arrest for armed robbery." Back at the police station, Sergeant Park was fielding phone calls from reporters who had heard about the federal response and wanted to know what was happening. The presence of 6 federal agents at a local police station was unusual enough to attract attention, and word was spreading quickly through the media. "No comment at this time," Sergeant Park said into his phone for the 4th time in 10 minutes. "Any information about ongoing investigations will come through the proper channels." Robert stood in the lobby with Agent Mitchell, watching the chaos unfold around them. His phone continued to buzz with calls and text messages from family members, friends, and co-workers who had seen news reports or social media posts about his arrest. "This is going to follow me for a long time, isn't it?" Robert asked. "Probably," Agent Mitchell admitted. "But the truth will come out. The media will report that you were cleared and that the real suspect was caught. Most people will forget about it within a week or 2. Robert wasn't so sure. In the age of social media and viral videos, even a false accusation could have lasting consequences. He thought about his nephew, who was starting high school next year, and how this might affect him if classmates found the videos online. Agent Walsh finished her phone call and rejoined the group. "Good news," she announced. "The actual suspect is in custody. Officers found the weapon and money from all 3 robberies." "3 robberies?" Robert asked. "The suspect hit 2 more places after you were arrested," Agent Walsh explained. "A gas station and a restaurant. Total take was probably less than $1,000, but he's looking at serious felony charges now." Sergeant Park approached the group with an update from the arresting officers. "The suspect is definitely not your guy," he said to Robert. About 5'8", maybe 150 pounds, Hispanic male with a scar above his left eyebrow. Nothing like your description at all. Robert felt a mix of vindication and frustration. The physical differences were so obvious that he wondered how the mistake had been made in the first place. What happened with the original identification? Agent Mitchell asked. Sergeant Park looked uncomfortable. The store clerk was pretty shaken up after the robbery. His description was vague, and in the heat of the moment, our officers made assumptions based on partial information. Partial information like what? Agent Walsh pressed. Tall black male in athletic clothing, Sergeant Park admitted. In hindsight, it wasn't nearly specific enough to justify an arrest. Agent Mitchell made a note in her notepad. This would definitely be included in her report about the incident. As they spoke, another patrol car pulled up outside with Danny Rodriguez in the back seat. Through the windows, Robert could see the real criminal for the first time. The differences were stark and immediate. That's him? Robert asked. That's him, Sergeant Park confirmed. Robert studied Danny's face through the car window. The man looked scared and defeated, nothing like the dangerous criminal Robert had been mistaken for. It was hard to believe that this small, frightened person had caused so much trouble for so many people. Danny was brought into the station in handcuffs, escorted by the two officers who had arrested him. As he passed through the lobby, his eyes met Robert's for just a moment. Danny looked confused, probably wondering who this tall man in running clothes was and why he was surrounded by federal agents. Different guy entirely, Agent Torres observed quietly. Officer Martinez, one of Danny's arresting officers, stopped to speak with Sergeant Park. Suspect confessed to all 3 robberies during transport, she reported. Says he needed money to pay off gambling debts. Gun was unloaded, by the way. Claims he never intended to actually hurt anyone. Robert felt a chill at that news. An unloaded gun was still dangerous if the victims didn't know it was empty. But it also suggested that Danny was more desperate than violent. What's going to happen to him? Robert asked. Multiple counts of armed robbery, even with an unloaded weapon, Sergeant Park replied. He's looking at serious prison time. As Danny was processed and led to a holding cell, Robert couldn't help but think about the chain of events that had brought them both to this moment. If Danny had chosen a different store to rob, or if Robert had finished his run 5 minutes earlier or later, none of this would have happened. Ready to go? Agent Mitchell asked. Your supervisor is waiting for your check-in, and we need to get you debriefed while the details are still fresh. Robert nodded and took one last look around the police station lobby. 2 hours ago, he had walked in as a suspected criminal. Now he was leaving as a vindicated federal employee with an escort of 6 agents. The irony wasn't lost on him that his arrest had actually led to the real criminal being caught. If Danny hadn't committed those additional robberies while Robert was in custody, the truth might have taken much longer to emerge. As they walked toward the federal agents' vehicles, Robert's phone rang. The caller ID showed his sister's number. I should probably take this, he told Agent Mitchell. Robert. His sister's voice was frantic when he answered. I just saw the news about your arrest. Are you okay? Do you need a lawyer? I'm fine, Robert assured her. It was all a mistake. The real criminal just got arrested and I'm being released. Federal agents are here to make sure everything gets sorted out properly. Federal agents? Robert, what exactly do you do for work? Robert smiled for the first time in hours. I'll explain later. Right now I just want to go home and pretend this never happened. But even as he said it, Robert knew that this night would be something he would never forget. And unfortunately, thanks to social media and news coverage, it was something that would probably follow him for a long time to come. 3 weeks after the arrest that changed his life, Robert sat in a conference room on the 15th floor of the federal building, staring at a stack of paperwork that represented the official investigation into what was now being called the downtown incident. Director Chen sat across from him, along with 2 investigators from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The investigation had expanded far beyond Robert's individual case to examine the police department's training procedures, arrest protocols, and history of racial profiling. The preliminary findings are concerning, said investigator Amanda Price, flipping through a thick folder. Your case appears to be part of a pattern of arrests based on insufficient evidence and racial assumptions. Robert nodded, but said nothing. He had spent the last 3 weeks reliving that night over and over, trying to understand how a simple evening jog had turned into a federal case study. The media attention had been intense but brief. Local news stations had covered the story for several days, focusing on the dramatic arrival of federal agents at the police station. National outlets had picked it up as an example of racial profiling in law enforcement. Social media had been less kind, with arguments breaking out in comment sections between people who supported Robert and others who questioned why a simple misunderstanding had required federal intervention. "How are you holding up personally?" Director Chen asked, her voice showing genuine concern. "Better than I expected," Robert replied honestly. "The hardest part has been explaining to my family what really happened. My nephew's friends at school have been asking him about his criminal uncle, even though all the charges were dropped." Investigator Price made a note. "That's exactly the kind of lasting impact we're concerned about. Even when someone is completely exonerated, the initial arrest can have long-term consequences." The second investigator, James Wright, had been reviewing video footage from the arrest. "We've analyzed all the cell phone videos that were posted online," he said. "Your behavior during the arrest was exemplary. You complied with all orders, remained calm, and repeatedly tried to provide identification to clear up the confusion." "Military training," Robert said simply. "Escalating a situation with police officers wasn't going to help anyone." Director Chen leaned forward. "The department wants to know if you're planning to file a civil lawsuit against the city or the police department." Robert had been thinking about that question for weeks. His sister, the lawyer, had offered to help him find a good civil rights attorney. Several law firms had actually contacted him directly, seeing potential for a significant settlement. "I don't know yet," Robert admitted. "Part of me thinks the officers were just doing their job based on bad information. But part of me wonders how many other people have gone through something similar without federal agents showing up to sort it out." Investigator Wright nodded. "That's exactly what we're trying to determine. We've requested arrest records from the police department going back 5 years, looking for patterns in how suspects are identified and detained." "What have you found so far?" Robert asked. "Let's just say your case wasn't unique," Investigator Price replied carefully. "There have been 17 other arrests in the past 2 years where suspects were detained based on extremely general descriptions and released without charges after the real perpetrator was caught." 17? Robert felt his anger rising despite his efforts to stay calm. 15 of those involved Black or Hispanic suspects, Wright added. "The pattern is pretty clear." Director Chen checked her watch. "Robert, you don't have to make any decisions about legal action today. The investigation is ongoing, and whatever you decide, the department will support you." After the meeting, Robert walked out of the federal building into the afternoon sunshine. The city looked the same as it always had, but he felt different moving through it. He was more aware of security cameras, more conscious of how police officers looked at him, more careful about where he chose to exercise. His phone buzzed with a text message from his nephew Tyler. "Uncle Rob, saw your interview on Channel 7 last night. You looked good on TV. Mom says you're famous now." Robert smiled. The local news station had done a follow-up story about the investigation, and Robert had agreed to a brief interview. He had tried to strike a balance between defending his own innocence and not condemning the police officers who had arrested him. "I don't think anyone set out to do something wrong that night," he had told the reporter. "But the system failed, and when systems fail, people get hurt. The question is whether we're going to learn from this and do better next time." The response to the interview had been mostly positive, though Robert had received some angry emails from people who thought he was being ungrateful for his release or that he was trying to make money from his 15 minutes of fame. Robert's phone rang as he reached his car. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but lately that usually meant another reporter or lawyer trying to reach him. "Mr. Johnson, this is Detective Lisa Wong with the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. I was wondering if you might have time to speak with me about your arrest." Robert hesitated. He had already given statements to the federal investigators, the media, and his own supervisors. "What kind of questions do you have?" "I'm investigating the officers involved in your arrest," Detective Wong explained. "Not for criminal wrongdoing, but for potential policy violations in how they handled the identification and detention process." "What's going to happen to them?" "That depends on what the investigation finds. Could range from additional training requirements to suspension or termination. I'd like to hear your perspective on their conduct." Robert thought about the 2 officers who had arrested him. They had been professional, if not particularly interested in hearing his explanations. They had followed their training and procedures, even if those procedures had been flawed. "Officer, can I ask you something?" Robert said. "Of course. Do you think those officers would have arrested a white man in the same situation?" There was a long pause. "That's exactly what I'm trying to determine," Detective Wong replied finally. Robert agreed to meet with Detective Wong the following week. He still wasn't sure how he felt about the officers facing discipline for what seemed like a systemic problem, rather than individual misconduct. That evening, Robert met his sister Jennifer for dinner at their usual restaurant. She had been his closest confidant throughout the ordeal, helping him navigate the legal and media aspects of his situation. "So what did the feds say today?" Jennifer asked over appetizers. "The investigation is expanding. Apparently I'm not the only person this has happened to." Jennifer nodded grimly. "I'm not surprised. The question is what you want to do about it." "I keep going back and forth," Robert admitted. "Filing a lawsuit feels like the right thing to do, but it also feels like opening myself up to more scrutiny and stress." "You know I'll support whatever you decide," Jennifer said. "But I think you should also consider what message you want to send. If you don't challenge this, it sends the message that it's okay." Robert picked at his food, thinking about Danny Rodriguez, the real criminal who had triggered this entire chain of events. Danny had been sentenced to 12 years in prison for the 3 armed robberies. His desperation for money had destroyed multiple lives, including his own. "The weird thing is," Robert said, "I keep thinking about the guy who actually committed the crimes. He made terrible choices, but I wonder if there was some way this all could have been prevented." "You can't save everyone, Rob," Jennifer said gently. "Some people make bad decisions and have to live with the consequences." "I know. But if the police had gotten a better description initially, or if the dispatch had included more details, none of this would have happened." Jennifer leaned back in her chair. "You're right. And that's exactly why this needs to be addressed systematically, not just swept under the rug." A month later, Robert made his decision. He filed a civil rights lawsuit against the city, not for monetary damages, but seeking policy changes in how suspects were identified and detained. The settlement, reached 6 months later, required the police department to implement new training programs, improve their description protocols, and establish an independent review board for arrests based on eyewitness identification. Robert also started speaking at community events about racial profiling and criminal justice reform. His story, while traumatic, had given him a platform to advocate for changes that might prevent others from experiencing similar injustices. The work wasn't easy, and Robert still struggled with the lingering effects of his arrest. He had developed a mild anxiety about interactions with police, and he found himself constantly aware of how others perceived him in public spaces. But he had also discovered a sense of purpose that went beyond his government job. If his experience could help create a more just system, then perhaps some good could come from that terrible night when his evening jog had turned into a fight for his freedom and reputation. The real victory, Robert realized, wouldn't be in any settlement or policy change. It would be in making sure that the next person who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time would be treated with the dignity and fairness that everyone deserved, regardless of the color of their skin.